They simply don't belong here.
The city of Geneva wore its February cold like a crown. Ice crystallized along the edges of Lake Leman, and the jet d'eau fountain stood dormant in the distance, as sleek black motorcades rolled one after another through the gates of the Palais des Nations. The grand, columned complex built by the League of Nations and now repurposed for the Global Innovation Summit, the most exclusive gathering of minds and money on the planet. Snow-dusted pines lined the approach road, and the massive Swiss flags above the entrance snapped in a sharp, dignified wind. Inside, the main ballroom had been transformed into something that looked like the inside of a dream. Circular tables draped in ivory linen filled the floor, each one hosting place cards engraved in gold. Crystal chandeliers threw soft light across the room. On the dais at the far end stood a sleek podium bearing the summit's emblem, a globe wrapped in a circuit pattern, and behind it, a floor-to-ceiling screen displayed a live satellite feed of cities across 6 continents. The air smelled faintly of cedar and expensive perfume. Heads of state, Nobel laureates, Silicon Valley founders, global health economists, and the world's most influential policy architects moved through the room with the practiced ease of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged. This was the world Ethan Harrington had been built for. Ethan was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of focused gray eyes that made people feel assessed rather than seen. He wore a dark charcoal suit tailored in London and carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had taken a $200 million Series B at 29 and turned it into a $7 billion technology investment portfolio by 40. His name appeared on 3 government advisory boards and 2 university endowment committees. He was expected to deliver the keynote on the 4th day of the summit, a speech about ethical AI deployment in emerging economies. But that was 4 days away. Tonight was the opening gala, and Ethan had arrived with his wife. Her name was Amara Harrington, and she was 38 years old. She was tall and dark-skinned, with close-cropped natural hair and a stillness about her that had nothing to do with shyness. She wore a floor-length dress the color of deep amber, unadorned except for a small gold cuff on her right wrist, a piece she had bought for $2 at a market in Nairobi years ago and had never stopped wearing. She did not carry a designer clutch. She wore no statement jewelry. Her elegance was not performed. It simply existed, the way deep water exists quiet on the surface, unmeasurable underneath. The whispers started before they had even crossed the room. At table 7, a hedge fund director from Frankfurt leaned toward the woman beside him, a venture capitalist whose name regularly appeared in Forbes, and said in a low, certain voice, "She doesn't look like she belongs here." The woman beside him tilted her champagne glass and replied, "Harrington always was unconventional. I heard she's from somewhere in East Africa. You'd think he'd have at least brought someone who could keep up with the conversation." Near the bar, 2 men in nearly identical Navy suits, one a logistics CEO from Seoul, the other a shipping magnate from Rotterdam, were less discreet. "Rescued her from poverty, I heard," one of them said, laughing. The other nodded. "These tech billionaires, always trying to prove something." Amara heard none of this, or perhaps she heard all of it. Her expression did not change. Ethan guided her by the hand toward their assigned table, nodding at acquaintances, pausing once to shake the hand of the German Federal Minister of Digital Affairs. Amara smiled warmly at the minister, who smiled back with a polite blankness that suggested he was not entirely sure who she was. The most cutting remark came from Vivienne Lacoste. Vivienne was 62, French, and the founder of a Paris-based global consulting firm whose clients included 3 central banks and the European Commission. She had silver hair cut geometrically at her jaw and wore a suit the color of steel. She was brilliant, ruthless, and widely admired, which made her opinions land with particular weight. She looked at Amara across the table as the first course was being served and said to the Swiss economist beside her, in French, she clearly assumed Amara could not understand, "Why would he bring someone so obviously uneducated to an event of this caliber? It's almost insulting to the other delegates." A brief, loaded silence settled at the table. Ethan looked up from his bread plate. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Amara placed her hand lightly on his forearm. She looked at Vivienne with an expression so composed it was difficult to read as anything other than grace. She said nothing. She simply smiled, And if you think that smile was surrender, stay with this story. Because what happened next changed every single person in that room. 20 minutes later, a summit coordinator in a dark blazer moved quickly across the floor, visibly distressed, and bent down to whisper to the event director seated near the stage. The event director's face shifted through 3 expressions in 4 seconds: confusion, alarm, and controlled panic. She pressed her earpiece and stood up. The scheduled master of ceremonies for the opening evening, a celebrated Swiss broadcaster named Henri Renaud, had collapsed backstage with a suspected cardiac event. He was alive, being attended to by medics, but he would not be taking the stage. In 90 seconds, delegates from 63 countries were expecting a formal welcome to the summit. The live broadcast was already running. Millions of viewers across the world were watching the feed. The event director approached Ethan's table. She was pale. "Mr. Harrington," she said quietly, "you are the most senior speaker with any connection to the program. Would you be willing to—" "I'll do it," said a calm voice. It was not Ethan. Every head at table 12 turned. Amara was already unfolding from her chair, smoothing the amber fabric of her dress with one hand. She looked at the event director with eyes that held neither performance nor apology. "I'll take the stage," she said. "Tell the technical team I'll need the main microphone." The event director stared at her. "Now, please," Amara said quietly. "The countdown is running." The coordinator, clearly with no better option, nodded and led her toward the wings of the stage. Ethan watched her walk away, and for the first time all evening, he smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that knows something everyone else is about to learn. At the podium, in the glare of 6 spotlights, and beneath the gaze of nearly 400 of the world's most powerful people, Amara Harrington adjusted the microphone, looked out across the room with absolute composure, and began. "Good evening," she said it in English first. Crisp, clear, with the faint cadence of someone who has spoken the language across multiple continents. Then, bonsoir, French, native in its rhythm, southern in its warmth, the French of Francophone West Africa, but precise enough to make Vivienne Lacoste slowly lower her champagne glass. Then, Wanshangho, Mandarin tones placed with surgical accuracy. The delegation from the Chinese Ministry of Technology exchanged glances. Then, Misa ul-Khair, Arabic, formal, classical, the Arabic of negotiating rooms and United Nations chambers. Then, Buenas noches, Spanish, with the deliberate diction of someone who has used it professionally, not just conversationally. And finally, Habari za jioni, Swahili. And with that word, something in the room shifted completely. It was not simply the number of languages. It was the fact that each one sounded lived in, not rehearsed, not performed. Each language carried the weight of a life spent inside it. The ballroom, which had been humming with the soft noise of 400 people eating, whispering, and moving, went completely silent. This is the moment the world remembers. But stay, because the languages were the least of what she carried onto that stage. Amara continued in English, her voice steady and warm, moving through the formal welcome with the ease of someone who had addressed rooms far more difficult than this one. She introduced the summit's themes, named the 6 priority panels, acknowledged the heads of state present by country, without a single note in her hand, and closed the formal welcome with a quote, one she delivered in 4 languages simultaneously, shifting mid-sentence, the way a river shifts around stone. Natural, inevitable, unstoppable. The applause began slowly, then filled the room completely. Vivienne Lacoste was not applauding. She was very still, and her expression had undergone a complete transformation. She was looking at the stage with the focused attention of someone recalculating something important. Backstage, after the welcome concluded, as delegates were moving toward their cocktail reception stations, a senior official from the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs found his way to Amara and took her hand with both of his. "Dr. Sese," he said, using a name no one in that room had heard yet. "I recognized your voice. It has been 10 years. He turned to the cluster of people now surrounding her and said simply, "This woman negotiated the Malakal Education Corridor in 2017. Do you understand what I am telling you? Where 6 other international delegations had failed over 4 years, She achieved a protected learning pathway for 40,000 displaced children in 11 weeks. She did it in 3 languages across 4 ethnic factions. And she did it as a private citizen, because the UN appointment had fallen through and she went anyway. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. That first silence had been shock. This one was something closer to reckoning. Over the next 3 days of the summit, Amara Harrington did not seek the spotlight. She sat in panel discussions and asked precise, devastating questions in the right language at the right moment. She was pulled aside by the Kenyan delegation, then the French Foreign Ministry representative, then a senior advisor to the Brazilian president. On the third evening, the summit's lead organizer quietly restructured the agenda to add an additional session, an unscheduled dialogue, on language inclusion and conflict-sensitive education policy, and asked Amara to chair it. She agreed. What those closest to her began to understand, over those 72 hours, was the full shape of her life. She had been born in Sierra Leone during the tail end of the Civil War. Her family had fled, more accurately through Guinea, then Côte d'Ivoire, then Chad, then Sudan, accumulating displacement like sediment. In each country she had learned the language, not in a classroom, in a camp kitchen, in a refugee processing line, in an informal school held under a tarpaulin by a volunteer teacher who came 3 times a week. She had learned Swahili from a Tanzanian social worker who brought hygiene kits and stayed to teach grammar. She had learned Arabic from a Sudanese engineer who believed that literacy was the only form of protection that could not be confiscated. She had learned French from necessity, Mandarin from a scholarship she earned at 19 that took her to Beijing, and Spanish during 2 years in Colombia, working with internally displaced communities near the Venezuelan border. She had not come from wealth. She had come from movement, constant, brutal, generative movement, and somewhere inside that movement, she had become something the world's most prestigious institutions rarely produce, a person who understood multiple truths simultaneously and could hold them without breaking. She had earned a doctorate in conflict studies from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, the same city where she now stood, and had spent 11 years working as a freelance conflict resolution specialist before her mother's illness brought her home to a quiet life. She had met Ethan not at a gala or a donor dinner, but in a community health clinic in Freetown, where she was helping displaced families access documentation, and he was visiting a digital infrastructure project. He had watched her spend 40 minutes patiently explaining the same form in 3 languages to a family who kept getting sent away. He had asked her to have coffee. She had said she was busy. He had come back the next day. On the final evening of the summit, Ethan took the stage for his keynote on ethical AI. Before he began, he paused. "I want to say something that is not in my prepared remarks," he said, looking out at 400 faces. "Many of you met my wife this week. Some of you made assumptions about her before she had spoken a word." He did not look at anyone in particular. He did not need to. "I fell in love with Amara because she walked into the hardest rooms in the world and made them safer. Not because of what she has, because of what she does with what she's been through." He stepped back from the microphone and led the applause himself. In the 3rd row, Vivienne Lacoste stood. She was the first on her feet. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the weight of every room that dismissed someone before they spoke, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. After the summit concluded, 3 things happened that did not make the main press coverage, but circulated quietly through policy corridors for months afterward. The United Nations formally requested Amara's involvement in a new multilateral education initiative targeting conflict-affected zones across the Sahel. A prominent European university offered her a visiting professorship, which she declined politely, and Vivienne Lacoste, the woman who had called her uneducated in French at a dinner table, sent a handwritten note to Amara's hotel room on the last morning. It read, "I spoke from ignorance, which is the only true form of being uneducated. Forgive me, and if you are willing, advise me." Amara read the note twice. Then she wrote back, "Call me next Tuesday." She left Geneva the way she had arrived, without fanfare, hand in hand with her husband, carrying nothing that could be taken from her, and everything that could not. The car that drove them to the airport passed the Palais des Nations, its flags unmoved by the wind now. The lake was gray and still, Amara rested her head briefly against Ethan's shoulder and looked out the window at the city that had whispered about her and then listened to her and, finally, called her name in the right voice. She had not come to prove anything. She never had. She had simply shown up fully, completely, in every language she had ever needed to survive, and let the room decide what to do with that. The room, as rooms eventually do, when they encounter something real, had gone quiet. And then, slowly, it had stood up. If you believe that the most powerful resume in the world is a life fully lived, drop a comment below and tell us who in your life carries more than the world knows. And subscribe, because the next story is going to hit even harder than this one.
They simply don't belong here.